You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leitch. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hi, it's David Leitch here, and welcome to an episode of Energy Insiders. Giles Parkinson is away for a couple of weeks, so he's somewhat gingerly entrusted me with the hot seat. And we have a great interview today with Michael Phelan from GridBeyond, which will be coming up after the break in a while. The points I wanted to cover today, in terms of news of the week, frankly, there isn't a great deal. The things that struck me were, first of all, a $1 billion increase in the cost of Project Energy Connect, which is the new link between South Australia and New South Wales that Transgrid's put in a cost increase application for. Transgrid say that despite the increase in costs, New South Wales consumers will still be better off because it will lead to a result in generation costs. While, of course, the cost increase is entirely regrettable, it's not inconsistent with transmission cost increases that we see around the world. I was only reading about transmission cost increases in ERCOT in Texas, as Doug Lewin has pointed out. He's a great expert on Texas. But what ERCOT was saying in their presentation about the transmission cost increases is that because the volumes are going up, much like airline travel, in the end the cost per unit comes down. So the key for lower electricity costs in one way, as well as having more renewable energy and more supply competing, is also to increase demand, because when you spread more volumes over a given cost base, you end up with lower unit costs. So that's one item, the increase in the Project Energy Connect transmission cost, which, by the way, that project is due to complete, I guess, towards the end of this year, and I expect we'll see some electricity flowing through it this year, which I personally think will be great. The second item of note, which is fairly minor, is that Internode is a very large battery complex being built in Brisbane, and the dual ID, the dispatch unit ID, for the second stage of that actually entered the NEM registration system this week. So I think that project is commissioning at pace. And I also noticed that in Queensland, another large battery of Stanwell's also started commissioning. So every day I've got a monitor a dash on my website, an indicator that shows the NEM-wide battery state of charge and discharge, and it can go up or down a gigawatt or 2 gigawatt hours in an hour. And it's quite interesting to watch that, and we expect the scale of that gauge to increase very steadily as we go over time. So they're the two items of news that I wanted to concentrate on. The other item of news is one that actually didn't happen, that we keep drawing attention to. And that is we've seen not very many large wind or solar projects actually get to final investment decision. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about policy in the federal government. The current government, federal Labor government, is likely to be in office for, I suppose, another 5 years, perhaps longer, but you could reasonably expect 5 more years now. During that time, and that will take us more or less to 2030. And by that time, we're supposed to have 80% renewable energy. But at the moment, unless the projects are started this year, we've mentioned that many times on this podcast, unless they're started, reach final investment decision this year, they won't be ready for 2030. So we have to start having some news on that. This and that points to what can be done to make to speed up things. And what's really missing, I suppose, is a couple of the projects still need some environmental approvals, but what's mostly missing is the revenue assurance for the equity providers. And that revenue assurance, that guarantee that the builder of the wind farm or the solar farm is going to get paid, obviously comes typically from one of the big gentailers. The scale of the projects that we're building now is typically up around a gigawatt, as opposed to the 200 and 300 megawatt projects that we used to build. And at a gigawatt size, you're talking typically between $3 and $4 billion of investment. And that's a lot that has to be stomached. And we need big PPAs that can only come from a few people. They could come from a government, but then unlikely to come directly from a government with one exception. Or they can come from the big gentailers. And even for the gentailers, they're quite a risk. Origin will certainly get the Delta Yanko wind farm to FID this year. But beyond that, everything is still uncertain. As we've mentioned on this podcast, one option for doing things is to take Tomago, which the federal government wants, Tomago aluminium smelter, the federal government wants it to continue. And the probable way that will happen is Tomago will get its electricity from Snowy. That's what the newspaper articles are. And Snowy will need to get the energy to supply that Tomago from somewhere. And they could possibly write PPAs that would enable one or two of these wind farms in New South Wales to get to financial close and to get built. So anyway, we'll be watching for news on that quite closely. But there was, of course, no news this week on that. There hasn't been any news on it most other weeks either. Which brings me to federal government policy, which is the last topic I want to cover in this intro. And this year, at the federal government level, we have a number of policy reviews. Right now, we have a review going on to the lease deduction that's available for electric vehicles. Later in the year, though, there's supposed to be a review of electric vehicle policy. In my opinion, the fringe benefit tax discount, which EVs get, that should be rolled into the broader electric vehicle policy review. I've said several times on this podcast that there are terrific savings. We've had people like Malcolm Turnbull agree, savings in terms of imported oil, savings in terms of being more secure in the event of conflict, which hopefully we'll never have. But overall, wonderful benefits to the Australian community of decarbonisation, like vehicle emissions are the next biggest source after electricity, and it's easy to get that moving along. And when we look at the policies that would work, virtually every policy expert you ever talk to says that more charging infrastructure is the best bang for the buck. And you can think about this from a psychology perspective. Why don't people buy an EV? There are two reasons. They're scared, and the main fear they have is charging fear. It's range anxiety. So we can take away that fear. We'll automatically make people more likely to buy EVs. And this doesn't just mean chargers on highways and in country towns. It means that all the people that live in units can be absolutely confident when they buy an EV, they'll be able to keep it as charged as they want to, whenever they want to. And then on the greed side, we need to reduce the cost of EVs. To some extent, that's happening already as the Chinese cars come into the market and as the second-hand market also grows. There are some great deals probably in second-hand EVs, particularly as ones that were on the lease a couple of years ago start to come off. But things like rego tax savings, which is a state government thing, fringe benefit tax reductions, or just a straight-out cash grant, they're the kind of things that, like the home battery scheme, that can really cause the sector to kick off. So I think that's something that should be done, that whole process, before the fringe benefit tax review is complete, because fringe benefit tax really is only one policy, and it's an effective one, but it may not be the most effective one. The second review that's really due this year, happened later in the year, and we'll talk about it again, is a review of the safeguard scheme. That covers like a couple of 100 million tonnes of carbon emissions by our largest emitters. And most of those emitters are, in fact, oil and gas producers and coal producers, together with steel works and cement works and a few other things. That's a complicated review to think about, because there aren't going to be many votes in it in a lot of ways, even though the carbon emissions are a really big part of the total. And it really requires the government to decide how much support, or tacit support, I don't mean direct support, but tacit support, it can allow for the gas industry in particular. I think anyone who follows politics understands that in West Australia, getting in the way of the gas industry is going to make the West Australian government probably fairly unhappy. So the big deal in that review probably is going to be around ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units. About half of those come from land schemes, planting trees and whatever. And as we all know, there's a lot of doubt about the total validity of all those schemes, even though I'm absolutely convinced that some of them are completely genuine and done with the absolute best interests in the line. But in the end of the day, letting these big gas and coal companies buy ACCUs as a way of continuing to produce coal and gas without doing anything else, it's kind of not going to build the future that we need for the future generations. So those are kind of the some of the policy issues. There's an awful lot more what we're going to do about for the networks as home batteries grow and how they're charging, but they're kind of more within for the wonks to think about. It's this big strategy where the federal government has the opportunity, but it needs to be making the decisions now because 5 years is not very long to get a lot done. And now I'd like to thank our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. And after this break, we'll be back with a great interview from the CEO of GridBeyond, Michael Phelan.
G'day, Alex Carey here. The GridBeyond ESA all-in-one home storage solution is here, and it's a game changer. It's packed with market-leading features, full home backup and 6-level battery protection. With up to 48 kilowatt hours in a single stack, the ESA is a breeze to install with no gateway needed. The GridBeyond ESA series is available now and priced to cover the 2026 drop in the rebate. Visit goodwe.com.au for more information.
Michael Phelan, thank you very much for joining Energy Insiders all the way from Ireland.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
GridBeyond, not a name well known in Australia yet, I'm sure it will be more. You do have a presence here, but you set up the company in 2010, I think. What did you see then? What was going on that inspired such a move?
Yeah, at that time we realised that flexibility in industrial commercial load and also storage would be very valuable for balancing renewables. So GridBeyond was set up at that time to start that work. So the Irish market, UK market were opening up and starting to realise that if they wanted to go to the levels of renewables that we're now seeing again in Australia, that you needed to have flexible load. The demand side needed to become flexible, and there were enabling markets to cause that to happen. So GridBeyond was set up to take advantage of that.
And basically, what is like a sort of software management firm? Tell us more about the products that you offer.
Yeah, so I suppose at two levels, we optimize at a site level batteries and generators and industrial loads and various things. So we find flexibility in those and put them into the markets when they're short. So with a battery, we could be charging at times when there's excess generation, like in the midday in Australia, and giving it back in the evening when there's a peak and there's a shortage of energy because the sun is going down. So it's really set up on that premise that we move things around. We move industrial loads, we move generation around, we move batteries around to balance the grid around renewables.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the what the situation is in Ireland then. We don't hear much from Ireland. You guys put a lot of wind energy. You obviously have batteries there now. What's been happening?
Yeah, so Ireland was originally probably one of the early adopters of, in particular, wind. So they got to very high levels of wind back even 10 years ago, hitting about 70%, which is quite high by most standards. And have continued since to add more wind and solar and various renewables to the grid. That causes lots of problems. So that causes issues with frequency, but also voltage. So they would definitely have been leading lights in terms of what would be required on a grid where inertia was falling and what would be needed from a frequency response point of view, what would be needed from a voltage point of view, and probably lead the world in that particular area. In terms of other areas, the acceleration probably hasn't been as fast as places like Australia, or as is now happening in Australia, where you're seeing very large amounts of renewables, very large amounts of batteries, and various systems going in, which are a lot higher than certainly the need for inertia, voltage, frequency. It's more about arbitrage, I guess, in that market.
Yeah. And with Ireland then, some of those issues that you talked about, sort of frequency and voltage and things like that, have they been addressed now more or less with the rollout of the sort of the systems that that you operate and the first big batteries? When did the first big batteries go in? We always think that we were the first.
No. Ireland put a battery in, I think, just before the Adelaide battery. It was the first where the very fast frequency, and then they got to synthetic inertia as a concept, I think, first.
Yeah, Michael, you worked on that, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, that's correct. So Ireland have been putting in batteries, say, for the last 9-10 years. So the early batteries, both Ireland and UK, were put in, around 2016, 2017 in volume. So we would have been involved in putting in significant numbers of batteries into both markets since that time.
So if we move on a little bit, I mean, really, you're working more with on the demand side than the supply side. Is that fair?
We do a bit of both. So we also have quite large batteries. So we optimize, say, 200 megawatt batteries in places like California, say 50 megawatt batteries and the likes in the UK and Ireland. So we also have large batteries. We'd be right across the UK or US as well. So we have batteries in California and CAISO. We've batteries in ERCOT. We've batteries in PJM. So we've even got batteries and lots of them in Japan. So we get to see the world really of, where renewables are going in, where there's a lot of batteries going in particular, and a lot of DSR. So we tend to follow the best markets for batteries and DSR and try to be there. And most of the time we are.
And you want to own the batteries or just dispatch them?
And we mainly dispatch them. So we have some batteries that we have joint ownership of through an SPV, mainly in UK and Ireland. But in other markets, we work with financiers. Say in Australia, we would work with financiers who will finance, say, behind the meter 5 megawatt batteries, various types of systems, and where the battery science, the optimizer, maybe the EMS SCADA, for those, but not necessarily the owner. So
that's right, because I think if I'm right about your business, and I only look at the website, your capital's 20-30 million pounds or something like that, and I'm not even sure if that's Irish pounds, and I'm not even sure if I've got the right currency. And I mean, you're a services firm rather than a capital provider.
Yeah, we're more of an AI kind of optimization type company than necessarily anything to do with heavy capital. So our main offerings really are around forecasting and optimization of distributed assets, and they can be, as you know, they can be batteries, they can be generators, they can be industrial loads, but they can also be just managing the imbalance on solar and wind.
So it's interesting because every market is very different. I used to go to these utility conferences, and I once asked NextEra in Boston, were they thinking of going somewhere else? And they said, we don't even know what the rules are going to be elsewhere in the United States, let alone anywhere else. But I mean, if you wanted to come into where you're in our market in Japan, and as you say, CAISO, which is California, and ERCOT, and Europe, I mean, they've all got very different rules. I mean, how does one piece of software adapt to all those different rule systems?
Yeah, we probably look at the other way around, that they're all fairly similar. So they all have a kind of a day ahead market. They all have maybe a real-time market. Australia is a real-time market. They all have ancillary services designed to do roughly the same things. So they're generally trying to load up or load down on very fast things like frequency, on slower things like reserves. A lot of it is around obviously setting up the market using either a day ahead or a real-time market, and then making corrections using reserves and final corrections on frequency and voltage. So we kind of view it the other way around, that they're all fairly similar, and the details of the rules are probably different, but the fundamental structures are pretty much always the same.
And I guess the battery integrators, the Fluences and the Teslas, they all have their auto bidder services, which, as you say, are optimized for particular markets, like in Australia, in our market. I mean, there's a lot of ancillary services revenue streams, which I'm quite sure are different to the ones in other markets. I mean, how do you find competing with the offerings from the battery integrators?
Yeah, we probably don't compete that much with those two, because if they're providing the turnkey solution, then they will do that. But what we have seen with Australian customers is that they might have, say, a solution from one of the aforementioned and they might want to optimize across the site. So there might be, I don't know, water company, or there might be an industrial site or something of that type, and they need to optimize the battery, but also with the solar, which I guess they'd get across, but then also with the industrial load or the water treatment or wastewater treatment. And then that might be challenging. So we, obviously with our heritage, are fairly familiar with industrial loads, commercial loads and various things. So we can optimize across the spectrum, if you like, for the site, and then put the flexibility that remains into the central market through the VPP.
Then you're competing with the demand response people in a sense, aren't you? Or I guess these things are quite complicated, aren't they? I mean, like that every business is quite different. You know, its power consumption is and its the value of the lost revenue of demand response differs. It's quite an individual piece of work for every client, isn't it? Is it or not?
Yeah, unless you're across, like we're across all the markets, so we work with every industrial that there is that has flexibility, and most commercials that have flexibility. So we're very familiar with the flexibility they have. If they have generation, we've done that many, many times, optimizing CHPs and the likes. And then when batteries, we're fairly comfortable with those as well, and solar. So we can generally optimize the whole lot together. And what you find is they're similar. An industrial plant, that's making cement in Australia makes it pretty much the same way as they make it in the UK or Ireland or America or anywhere else. When they decide to put in solar and batteries and various things, they face very, very similar challenges that you would see in the other markets. Obviously, the market varies, but the assets don't, I suppose, it would be the way of thinking about it. So you're facing a different market, maybe with somewhat different price situations, but the rest of it is pretty much the same because the assets are pretty much the same. They're in a different ambient, but generally they're the same.
So how sort of flexible can some of these industrials be, and sort of how are they sort of coming to getting to this moment? Because before, I guess they just thought that they just do their thing and just carry on. Now they've got all these different options: on-site generation, batteries, picking their time of day to use more power or less. What can you sort of tell us about the sort of the levels of flexibility and the willingness of the industrials to take it up? I mean,
if I'm commenting only from Australia's perspective, and I know about cement. It's really all about the heat. I used to cover cement industries at Kilns. It's all about the heat to make the cement, not about the electricity consumption so much. And in Australia, at least, an awful lot of it's about process heat and electrification, as opposed. Michael, I think, mentioned combined heat and power, CHP, a little bit, but that's the challenge in Australia. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, industries are electrifying. So anyway, we're trying to. Yeah, sorry, Michael.
Yeah. So just to take cement as an example, so. You're 100% correct. The kiln and the heating is an issue, and obviously the electrification of that is important. But cement plants already have a lot of flexibility, so they're typically the raw mill, for example, and the cement mill are typically a few megawatts, say up to 5 megawatts apiece. So you could have 10 megawatts of flexibility in a cement plant that could be put into WDRM wholesale FCAS. So it's not nothing, and then you can put a battery against the fixed load. So you can have a solar and a battery against the fixed load. And that's typically how they go about electrifying in the very short term. And then they're looking at how can they provide, the kiln process and that in a better way that uses less electricity. So that's typically how they would go about the electrification. But they're very active participants in all markets. Like we've cement plants all over the world, in grid services markets, in wholesale markets. In terms of intelligence, what we have been doing for them is they typically have to make to a production plan. So they have a plan of what they want to do, but generally that plan doesn't take energy into account. So what we've been doing is coming up with an optimization system that forecasts, say, 7 days of energy price in Australia. And then we're looking at the production plan. In other words, what they need to make and silo levels and various things for them. And then we're coming up with a 7-day plan of how they might operate, mindful of when we believe the high prices are going to be in the Australian market. So in that way, they're optimizing their production against energy price and avoiding very high prices that they might be on index towards, especially with the raw mill and cement mill.
Mm. And what other sort of industries have you sort of been working with in Australia or overseas?
So in Australia, people like the metals industry, so they making steel and various things, arc furnaces and others, putting those into F-gas. Also mills of various types in the market, talking to some of the water companies, coal stores. Any large industrial really with flexibility, the gas companies, the gas to liquid people, we typically put those into market as well. Overseas, pretty much the same. Like it's the heavy industrials. So you're putting everybody from chlorine makers to even, you come down the market, you come down through multi-site. So in UK and Ireland, we'd have supermarkets in the market. We'd have distribution centres in the market. We're even in the UK these days looking at even social housing and things like that, where they might put in batteries with solar and things and putting those into the market.
Talk to me a little bit about supermarkets, because what their power consumption is really for cold storage and light mainly, isn't it? And how can you can't really turn you might be able to turn the freezer down in England, or even Ireland, but you're not going to be turning the freezer down in Adelaide in summer, I'm pretty sure.
You can set point control it. They have an inertia. So the products, like if you drive a product from say -18 to -25, it has a fair bit of extra cooling in it, and that will have a certain hold across the peak. So the price, if it's $19,000 and the grid is about to fall over in Australia, they're probably one of the things that could actually turn down for a period of time, have a carry, especially if the doors are closed, and sit there happily for an hour or two and hold their temperature as they heat from -25 to -18, for example.
Yes, that's interesting. But we've been talking about demand response on and off here on this podcast, and for like 10 years. And I looked around the world, and I can rarely find where demand response makes much difference to the overall system in aggregate, but it certainly can make a difference to individual producers and consumers, can't it? But it comes at a cost, like turning things up and down increases wear and tear, and sometimes there's missed revenue. Cement kilns want to operate at a very constant temperature. I guess the ball mills and stuff can operate on and off. You can turn them on more easily.
Yeah, no, that's correct. The things are going on and off anyway. Like we're more synchronizing them to grid prices. So as you say, the cement mill or the raw mill won't be running 24/7 unless there's 24/7 demand. So they have to go off sometime, and they might as well be off when the price is high and the grid is under severe pressure. And that's really what we're doing. We're kind of, in that instance, synchronizing the plan with to make sure that the mills are not running if they don't need to run when the prices are very high.
So, Michael, just tell me, how's your business going? What's revenue up on last year?
Yeah, so you were kind of saying that DSR maybe, it doesn't make that much difference, but in reality it does. Like we would have gigawatts of power, like that's fairly significant by any standards, that we put into markets. So even from a revenue point of view, like we're probably from a euro point of view, we'd be heading on towards 100 million of revenue. So it's a decent amount of DSR and batteries being put into markets, and obviously them keeping the grids in balance. So the likes of the National Grid in the UK, the Air Grid people in Ireland, some of the American utilities would rely heavily on these types of systems. And if you take the US as an example, they're very interested in this area because it's one of the quicker ways of finding flexibility that could be used to build data centers. So
it's not a renewable energy thing. So that's why they're interested in the USA. Sorry, that's a silly comment. But I thought data centers are a hot topic. But training loads are not particularly interruptible, are they? And certainly, like the query loads are not interruptible either. So how do you fit a data center into that kind of system?
Yeah, no, you're right. It would be somewhat different. So sometimes, mainly what data centers are doing today is they're either using the generators they already have or putting in batteries. So we'd have put batteries into data centers that can participate in grid services, and the data center can happily go along doing what it does in terms of providing the data processing to people. So that's roughly where data centers are today. Going forward, they might look at, are starting to think about at least the chillers and whether there could be some flexibility in those. And then is there any kind of determining what is the flexible load, like what load is discretionary and can actually be delayed or could be moved around to another data center if a particular area is under pressure. But that's early work in progress, I would describe it as. But they're starting to figure out, is that possible?
I was reading about one data center in the USA, I think so, it might be Microsoft, but I'm not sure. It was like 500 megawatts of load, of which 200 megawatts was cooling rejection. And they've got all these big banks of gas generators inside there sitting around for the reserve power. It's quite an interesting topic to me.
Yeah, no, they could be forced into the market. So in places like Texas and possibly PJM and that, they are considering that, and maybe Ireland, that if the grid is in an emergency situation and these people have backup power, that maybe the backup power would be used, one, to keep the data center going, but also to keep the grid going in those instances. So I think you're going to see more activity from data centers going forward. And
I don't know if you have a view on it, but data centers, particularly in training mode, can also suddenly stop consuming power very suddenly when, there's some issue that causes the training to be interrupted, and all of a sudden you get a very big load reduction, which can cause just as much frequency control as supply dropping off.
Yeah, you can use a battery, as you probably know, as a damper against that, so it can kind of compensate for those pulsing or, if you like, fast changing of loads in a data center. And I think that will be the solution for that, or at least one of the solutions that people consider for that going forward.
Where in the world does demand response and demand management this happen very well in terms of not just technologies, but also market signals and market encouragement? We get the sense in Australia that it is an undeveloped market, that the opportunity is there. There's been some mechanisms which have existed, but they haven't been fully exploited.
Yeah, probably the best market we operate in is the UK. So the UK is a fairly mature market. We've been doing, I suppose, demand response of various types there nearly since 2010, 2012. The market has moved kind of gradually at a steady pace all the time. So they saw the value of demand response and batteries, started bringing demand response in around that time, started bringing batteries in around 2017, designed all their frequency response and ancillaries, I suppose, primarily around batteries and to some extent around demand response. But we're happy to get it all into that, get those things into the market. Then more recently, they've allowed aggregators then put load into the central market, say the wholesale market on the P415, to allow that flexibility show up in the wholesale markets. And probably where they're at the moment is they're looking at the DNO services. So if there's a constraint on a DNO network, having a marketplace there that aggregators like us can bid into. And if we have a solution, then we would solve the problem rather than having to build a new distribution line. So I think they've constantly been innovating, constantly using demand response batteries and various systems, flexible systems like that in a good way to try and optimize the grid.
How much demand response or power can you offer from your aggregation services in the UK?
Oh, we would be again in the well over a gigawatt of power in the UK being offered through really the combination of batteries, through load, through generation of every type, I suppose, into the market, and also some front of the meter battery systems, sometimes generation systems as well.
So if a 1 gigawatt gas generator, I guess, or a link to the Europe, transmission link dropped out, you could turn around and offer a gigawatt immediately.
Yeah, we can compensate for that. But that's what it was set up for in the first place, was to compensate for the likes of the loss of an interconnector line or a fairly significant failure on the grid. So there's a few of us who do it. But yeah, that was the original theory. It has moved on from there, as you know, in the more than in Australia, where people are moving on from those ancillaries and frequency to more arbitrage and general balance of the grid.
Trading, thanks. Arbitrage is a perfect profit. I'm very fussy about that word as a financial person. It has moved on, but I'm just interested in this 1 gigawatt. You can control all of that instantly from your piece of software. You could just issue a button and 1 gigawatt would suddenly turn up within what time frame?
It depends on the asset. So some of that will be in frequency services. Some of it will be in reserve services. Some of it will go into wholesale services. So it really depends on the asset as to what speed we can ramp and what we can do. But it would all show up in minutes. Some of it would show up in in fractions of a second to a second.
But it's not so coordinated that it could all come just like a battery. I mean, a 1 gigawatt battery can do it in 5 milliseconds or something.
It would be similar. But the thing is, it's made up of different things. A chunk of it is batteries. A chunk of it then is generation. A chunk of it is industrial and commercial load. So they're all going to have different characteristics. But roughly as blocks, you can define what performance they have, what ramp rates they have, and what they can do. So that's what we do. That's why we call it one name for it is a virtual power plant. It's a power plant with ramping up and ramping down rates. And that depends on the asset you're talking about. Obviously, our batteries are the same as everybody else's. They can perform just as fast as anybody else's, but the generators are similar to other generators. If they're gas turbine types, they're going to have the same performance as any other gas turbine type.
Given the fall in battery prices, it seems to me that the economics just favour doing a simple battery rather than having all this demand response. Sorry, Giles, I'm taking up too much time here.
The demand response, though, has lower marginal cost in that the investment has already been made, whereas the batteries have a cost, and we know from funding batteries and things like that you do want to get a return. And when the markets go towards marginal cost, generally DSR is more attractive than batteries.
Well, where's Australia falling short? What are the opportunities to sort of grow this opportunity in Australia? What would you like to see?
I think Australia is kind of still at the very large battery stage, and even incredibly large battery stage. And your question, is that the right answer for the type of grid that Australia has? Like, will there not be problems in the distribution network in a while, like you're seeing in the UK at the moment? And should that be getting more attention? Because if you put in massive batteries, at particular points of failure or particular points in the system, then as constraints start coming up in the distribution network, will the business case be for batteries? Should that get a bit more thought? Maybe.
Tell us more about that. What's happening in the UK that you fear that Australia could also experience?
So in both UK and Ireland, they're probably moving on from the central system and managing the central system, which they've been doing for years, to the distribution networks, and maybe what the needs of the distribution networks are based on load growth. And starting then to consider what is the right answer for flexibility in those areas, and if so, how much do you need, and can you set up marketplaces or some method to actually call out where flexibility is needed in the distribution network?
It's interesting. I mean, it's we're sort of in Australia, we're sort of learning a lot about sort of visibility and capability on the distribution network. Companies with digital twin models and things like that, sort of identifying sort of areas which can be exploited, which hitherto had not been recognised.
Giles, the cynical viewpoint is that the distribution network spent years arguing that all the extra solar was going to cause problems for them being exported, and they needed more revenue to protect against that. And now they're turning around and saying too much power is coming into the networks, and they need more money to protect against that. Whatever it is, the distribution network needs more revenue. Sorry.
Well, no, that's just them just sort of gaming the system. But I mean, I think Michael's point is that they're basically probably up till now, or maybe this is not the case, but up till now they haven't quite realised what the opportunities are, what they can see.
Yeah, it does look like it's at a slightly earlier stage. So if I look at UK, there's a marketplace there, so we can see right across all their distribution network operators what flexibility they require to keep the lights on in that distribution system over the next few years. And if we can provide that true flexibility in storage and various other things, then we'll do that first. If we can't, they'll build a distribution line then over the next few years. Ireland has kind of gone the same way. So ESB and others have kind of studied the distribution network and are again looking to put batteries or some kind of flexible system into the worst constrained areas on the distribution network. So are you talking about sort of what we call sort of community batteries or neighbourhood batteries, or smaller batteries of the 5 to 10 megawatts type situation, having more of those? Is that what you're sort of getting to, or are you just thinking? Yeah, kind of in a planned way though. So they're kind of figuring out what's going to constrain, when it's going to constrain, and why would I need a battery in that particular area. So it's fairly well planned, it's fairly well thought out. And then they're solving their bigger problems first. Like their UK probably has a projection that maybe in 5 years, if electrification continues, you could have 25% constraint on the distribution network. So you're going to have to do something about that. Like it eventually becomes very difficult to keep up if everybody electrifies. So then it's how do you solve that in a more innovative way, maybe using flexibility and batteries and various things.
Because in Australia, we don't, it's different for the most part. We can become self-sufficient. It's become easier and easier the throughput through the grid in both directions is probably becoming less and less, because so much of the residential network has 40% has behind the meter rooftop solar. And if they all put batteries on, and the batteries are so cheap now, I think you can get 20 kilowatt hours for 7,000 Australian dollars less. Then you hardly need the grid at all, except in the middle of the winter. And so I think in the network problem for residential in Australia is actually is stranding, in a sense. The grid is needed less and less.
Yeah, except for the times, as you say, when the sun isn't quite there, like when it's cold in Melbourne or whatever, and the sun is doing about as much as it does in Ireland in the winter. It's the grid is there probably for those times. The second thing is I think in some of the markets you're kind of seeing the constraints are probably caused by bigger things. So it's a housing development, it's a new factory, it's a data center or something like that is causing a constraint in an area, and then it's a question of how do you solve that constraint. Or otherwise a lot of electrification is going on. There's a lot of EVs going on in, there's a charging system going in, maybe fast charging system, there's electrification of heat going in Europe, normally in UK or Ireland. Those things are causing problems.
How to address them then? So tell us a bit more about EVs and just to sort of finish off. And because, what's the share of EVs in Ireland? I think it's a lot higher than it is in Australia. It must be in the high teens or even 20%. In Australia, we're still struggling around the 8s and 9s and 10s.
Yeah, it is higher in either Ireland or UK. You're seeing a reasonable level of EV adoption. You're also seeing some of the public sector electrifying. So the bus system in the UK is fairly well electrified. So most of them have done a reasonable amount of electrification. We work with them. We've kind of worked probably with most of the UK bus companies, looking at what flexibility they have, seeing what can be done with it in energy markets, and also optimizing them from a tariff point of view. So that has gone forward. I mean, they do cause constraints sometimes on the network in the evenings and various things when the buses come back and all want to be charged. You can put batteries into those systems, obviously, to optimize those. You can do the same with fast charging points and putting batteries again in there to manage the grid capacity or the grid constraint that might exist in that area, so they can charge more vehicles. So there is a fair bit of innovation in that area, and it has been moving at a reasonable rate.
Michael, we are running out of time, but I mean, I'm interested in, because you don't have, like in the UK, the same sort of midday duck curve that we have, or that California has, or you don't have this opportunity to charge the batteries in the middle of the day. You'd be using gas or imported power or offshore wind. I mean, how does it? Where's the power coming from?
Yeah, you're right. It varies by the country. So if you're here in Ireland, it probably is the wind. So you're watching for cheap, negative priced wind at night and things like that, and loading up on that. If you're in Australia or you're in California, you're looking at duck curve, and obviously there's AI systems doing all of this. So they're just trying to find the lowest, the bottom, top and bottom kind of prices, TB2s and TB4s and various things, and trying to charge on obviously the bottom and release on the top. And then you look at the marginal cost of a battery to make sure what you're doing actually makes sense. So yeah, I mean, it's heavily automated, but you're correct. You're following different patterns in different markets. In
the UK, you're probably charging your battery from gas or offshore wind, aren't you? I don't really know.
Most likely wind, I'd say. There's still quite a bit of wind on that grid. So the low prices would typically be driven by lots of wind on the grid. And in the summer, decent amount of solar as well.
Never would have thought. They just had an auction actually with 5 gigawatts of solar this week, actually. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, it makes reasonable sense. And maybe it's getting warmer in this part of the world or something, but solar seems to be making more sense all the time, even in this part of the world.
Strange enough to think. Well, Michael, look, thank you very much for that's actually quite a really interesting quick journey around the world, and also the opportunities in Australia. And I think it's sort of something that we don't think enough of is demand response and thinking about the demand side of the equation. So thanks very much for your insights.
Just one final question. How is your business growing in Australia? Is it growing well? I mean, you say you're going to be out here next year. I presume it's not to visit someone. I mean,
yeah, we have a certain amount of demand response activity in the market already, and we are seeing some of the customers are starting to go on I suppose it's a cost risk management type approach with a bit of path to zero carbon, and are starting to put in batteries. So we have a few of those coming along behind the meter. We have some batteries as well, 5 megawatt batteries that we're trading and optimizing. So we're starting to see growth in the market in Australia. Some of our partners as well are pretty strong in Australia, so we see it as a good market for us.
Good stuff. Okay, Michael Phelan, thank you very much once again for joining Energy Insiders.
Okay, guys, it's been interesting.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.